Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and Imperial Voices, and this is one of the regular webinars that we do. And today we're going to look at something that I hadn't given much thought of until someone suggested that we do this webinar. And it's about active travel, but it's about active travel for women and how they travel differently and they face different problems to men. And, you know, that sort of intrigued me. And so I thought it would be really interesting to do that. And we've got with us today Julia Valentine and Cat Leggat. Now, they're both members of the Women's Equality Party, and I know they both, and particularly Cat, has done quite a bit of research in this and has been very concerned about this. So I thought it was really worth talking about it and finding out why. So Julia and Cat, welcome to this webinar today, and it would be great if you could begin by just telling us a bit about yourself and your own background. So Julia, can I start with you? Can you tell us about your background?
So my name is Julia Valentine. I have been a member of the Women's Equality Party since it started in 2015, since became the leader of the Haringey branch, which started up pretty soon after the creation of the Women's Equality Party, and it is one of the areas of the biggest interest in the whole country. Very keen on promoting environmental issues within the Women's Equality Party, and keen to promote the fact that the environment is a feminist issue. And by day, I'm a marketer for an IT consultancy.
Okay, that's fine. That's very brief. That's great. And Kat, how about you?
Kept it brief for you.
Yeah, it was very good, very good. 10 out of 10. So Kat, what about you? What's your background?
So I've been a member of the Women's Equality Party for about 6 months. I'm also an active campaigner on climate issues with a youth group. And then by day, I work for an environmental NGO, primarily on air pollution. Okay,
now you belong to the Women's Equality Party, and the thing about that is that it's quite a small party at the moment, but quite influential. So, I mean, what do you look at yourself as, Julia? Do you look at yourself as a party that's a pressure group to influence other parties, or do you look at yourself as a party that wants to gain power?
I would say both, actually. So what we're trying to achieve is quite different to other parties. We're trying to combat certain disadvantages for women, and we want to say ultimately equality, women's equality is better for everyone. So there are problems such as inequality when it comes to health, inequality when it comes to education, media representation, and so on. So there are actually 7 key objectives that we have, and we will take other votes away. We will take votes away from the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Greens, whoever is, and especially the Conservatives. We will definitely take away their votes unless they are willing to take on our aims. But we have had very successful campaigns in recent years with pushing our aims and trying to collaborate with other parties to try and achieve those goals. And most recently, we had a huge success in the last elections where we had made the point that certain MPs had been allowed to run as MPs despite the fact that they were under investigation for allegations of sexual abuse or assault. And when that happens, when there's an allegation of fraud, the MP is suspended and they are not allowed to stand until that allegation has been seen through. While currently that's not the case when it comes to sexual abuse. So we got those people to stand down, and every single one of those men were unable to run. So that was our success, and we saw that as much as a success as having an MP in Parliament. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, so yeah, so you've had a real effect, and you're right. I mean, you don't have to have power to be able to have influence, and you clearly have that. Now one of the things you're interested in what we're talking about today is active travel, and as I said, know what that meant. I thought that meant flying all over the world and you know, going to some exotic place. And I was wondering why you were going to be doing that in the time of COVID. And then I found out what it meant, and that was really interesting. So maybe, Kat, you could explain to us what you mean by active travel.
Yeah, so really simply, active travel is travel where you as an individual are active. So walking, cycling, scooting, rollerblading, that about covers it, I think. But yeah, those forms of travel that are particularly low pollution because you yourself are the mode of transport.
And what do you mean when you talk about active travel for women?
So women travel in different ways to men, and they experience the world around us in different ways. And so their access to travel is different, the barriers they face are different. And when we were thinking about this topic and bringing it to this webinar, I thought about how essentially we have two problems, that there's the problem of gender inequality and the problem of the climate crisis. But in finding gender-based solutions to the climate crisis, including through active travel, we have this one joined up solution that is both positive for the environment and positive for social justice.
So, I mean, do you consider it, Kat, that, you know, active travel for women and doing something about that is really a feminist issue?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that was a short answer and very precise. And I guess, Julia, you feel the same. And I mean, you mentioned this in your opening, or Kat did, that it's also an important environmental issue as well, isn't it?
Yes. So I think the interesting thing is that very often people will accuse the Women's Equality Party of being a single issue party, and we've proven time and time and again that actually women's issues cover everything, and we very much believe that, say for example, the Greens are doing a wonderful job in saving the environment and saving our planet. But we think that there is another lens to this, and the feminist lens is currently not being discussed. So it's crucial that the Greens and all parties think of these things, because there is another aspect that is being ignored, and that is women's equality in environmental issues.
Which travel is clearly one of those as well. I gather there was a report published recently about active travelling for women that was called "Are We Not There Yet?" Is that something, Kat, that's influenced you, or have you had this interest before the report came out?
So I actually only read the report quite recently. I believe it's by Sustrans. But for me, I've always been interested in feminist issues, and I've always been interested in climate change issues, and bringing them together just makes a lot of sense.
So this is something that you had, you know, a lifelong interest in, and it wasn't just about that report. You mentioned about how men and women travel differently, and they do. Some people may not understand that. I certainly didn't until I read about it. I mean, could you explain to people how men and women travel differently?
Yeah, so on a really simple statistical level, the modes of transport that men and women take aren't the same. Women are more likely to walk, men are much more likely to cycle. Women are actually more likely to take more trips by car. They're also more likely to take the bus, and then men are more likely to travel by train. But then if we look at it in more of a purpose-driven sense, women are much more likely to be escorting children to school, taking them to leisure activities, doing the shopping, whereas men tend to have quite a direct purpose of travel. They tend to go to and from work. And so that means that we don't operate the same as we travel. Women are quite likely to do something called trip chaining, which means you'll do lots of different stop-offs on your journey. And that in particular really affects how we travel.
It's interesting that. I mean, why is it you think, and maybe you could answer this, Julia, why is it you think women travel differently to men? You explained, you know, shorter trips and what they do. I mean, why is it? Why are we so different?
Well, actually, I have more recommended reading. Caroline Criado Perez wrote the book Invisible Women, and it was about statistics. Basically, I think all of Women's Equality Parties read it, but it's all about the statistics behind research in general, you name it, whatever field, and women are so often excluded. Or the common idea is this is what we know, and we base it on men. Men become the norm. And it's not necessarily done deliberately or maliciously, it's just that men tend to have the jobs that are doing the research, so they think of themselves, so therefore they don't take into account these things. So she used an example of women in a certain area in, I think it was Norway, where no one had thought about the pavements being covered in snow, and the fact that that was causing a lot of accidents. And it hadn't really occurred to the men who'd done the town planning that actually it was women who were very often making the walk to childcare institutions, to go to look after elderly relatives, doing the shopping and the multi trips that Kat was talking about. It's those things outside of your daily work, which traditionally women have those roles, and traditionally, and of course this isn't everyone, but traditionally women tend to do care work, women tend to do the shopping, and that will involve doing a lot of different trips. Women also tend to have not have a car, so women drive a lot less, and that's the case in many countries, and in London as well. Car ownership is much higher among men than it is among women. So for all of those reasons, women just have a very different experience when it comes to their daily travel.
Okay, so that gives us some idea of why, because of the different things they do, the care and childcare and so on. Is there a particular problem as well for disabled women and older women, Kat? I mean, we're talking about all women, but that's a sort of general term. But older women and disabled women have particular problems, don't they?
Thinking about older women, when you think about walking and cycling in particular, it's quite dangerous when viewed from the outside, and older women tend to feel the most vulnerable. And when they're cycling, they're worried in particular about falling off their bike and doing themselves an injury that means they can't. They maybe then can't go about their general daily lives, and so that really stops them from choosing that method of active travel. I think Jules is probably the best one to ask about the experience of disabled women.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I did actually want to invite our fellow Haringey member, who Dr. Sharabajaya Kumar. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it, but she has she's living with disability. She's in a wheelchair, and she has she's partially sighted, so that can cause a lot of problems for her when it comes to getting out and about. She can't just go somewhere on her own, and while there are problems for both disabled men and women, and also older men and women, there is a problem where women will tend to be more, maybe less confident, and like Kat was saying, that if there's a worry that they'll be hurt, then they'll eventually close themselves in and not travel. So for her, it's very important to think about. She called it the social model. I think it's something to look up. But she was talking about the social model being a way of town planning, thinking about those issues first. So rather than it being an afterthought, we think, for example, London is currently readdressing how we walk.
The report also says that women travel very often for mental health reasons, physical health, but mental health reasons as well. Could you explain that, why they would do that rather than men?
So it's been shown that being out there and exercise is great for your mental health, and I think this is something that women are perhaps more aware of. I think it's also something that we live in a society where women are more likely to act on their mental health in comparison to men, and that's why this is a feminist issue rather than a women's issue, because it benefits both people to create greater equality in the transport sector.
And I mean, did you want to say anything about the mental health issue? Because travel is a way of, or going out actively is a way of, clearing your mind and so on. I mean, women go and meet other women, they meet and they talk and they travel. And is that a way of engagement and of dealing with mental health, Julia?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think one thing that I've noticed a lot of is the focus on going back to work in offices that's hitting the press at the moment, and this sort of nostalgic idea of the tube and how wonderful it is. And yes, it's a wonderful invention and we're all very grateful for it. But something that's not being discussed as much is the mental health benefits to walking or cycling to work. That's a huge benefit, and as well as physical. And I think that's I think, again, exactly as Kat says, it's a feminist issue, meaning it's men's and women's equality that we're talking about. It's a very important aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about public policy and having an effect on that, I noticed that the report again, said that women are fearful very often of walking and cycling because of safety and so on, and yet we know that women cycle more than men by far. And so is public policy to increase, say, cycle lanes, is that a benefit to women? Would you argue that, Catriona?
Yeah, absolutely. Safe and particularly physically separated cycle lanes are a huge part, or should be a huge part of this solution. There's a project that's led by a woman called Rachel Aldred, and it's all about near misses. And women are far more likely to be involved in a near miss incident than men are, although the fatality rates are quite similar. Women are almost twice as likely to be subjected to one of these near misses. And so if you're in what you would think of as a traditional green painted line cycle lane, you're much more exposed to that, whereas having a physical cycle lane where there's a space and you're in a different sphere from the cars, it really reduces that feeling of being unsafe.
Okay, so I mean, that's the psychological thing that women will feel. But given the fact that there are differences, I mean, how would you change public policy? What would you want to see happen to make active travel for women easier and safer, Kat?
I think the first thing would be representation. So women actually only account for 22% of workers in the transport sector across the UK. And so the needs of all those women who are out there participating in travel aren't being heard to the same extent as men. And so getting over that first hurdle and making that representation more equal would be a great first start. Other really great things would be improved signage. So that's particularly thinking about cycling, whereas representation would be great for women across the entire transport sector. But women are, if you're doing lots of little trips and having to get from place to place, being able to know where you're going is a really key part of that. And then I think the other big thing is to make sure that this data is still being collected. There's obviously some really good reports out there, but consistently collecting gender disaggregated data and then using that to develop gender responsive budgets and gender responsive plans is such a key part of what the policies should be including.
Yeah, I mean, but that's interesting and how you would change it. And that figure you gave, about 22% of female workers in transport, is one I was going to mention to you because I saw that as well. I also found in Scotland that women only represent 6.25% of head of transport bodies. Now, I mean, that's pretty shocking, isn't it? And in a way, that makes it difficult for women's views to be heard and for policies to be implemented that would benefit women. I mean, do you find that the case, Julia?
Yeah, and it's across the board, and that's why we take these focuses and we try to give it this feminist lens, because if you think about all the great work that's being done, there's only so far that it can go if you don't focus on these aspects. So we need to be that voice to try and push those issues with all parties, and it needs to be also a cross-party effort. There are 51% of 51% of the population is women in the UK, so it really does affect every party, every voter. You know, that we really need to think about these things, and at the moment, it's still being a bit left behind.
Well, it's a question of A, thinking about things, and B, making sure that women are represented fairly on those boards. I saw some European research that shows some strong evidence from many sectors that equal representation and diversity in decision-making bodies has a positive impact on service design. And is that something, Kat, that you think we should be working towards, making sure there's equality on the decision-making bodies?
Absolutely. I think people, deliberately or not, tend to think from their own experience. And so if you have greater experience in those decision-making bodies, then there can be improved services for people living with disabilities, for women, for people of colour. It's all about making sure that everybody is in the room so that all of their voices can be heard.
And Julia, is that something that you feel strongly about as well, that we should have better representation so that we can have policy that reflects what women want? And is that something that you see the Women's Equality Party pushing and campaigning on?
Yes, it's a really good point as well about the fact that we need to think about intersectional feminism. So thinking about every group that might face an additional challenge in representation. They might face extra discrimination purely because, well, technically we live in a white supremacist patriarchy that is also ableist, and it's something that's not really discussed. But while we live under that scenario across the whole world, we cannot exclude any group. We have to think about all of the different groups that face extra discrimination. So if you're talking about cycling, for example, especially in London, women of colour are even less likely to cycle than white women. And that's another issue where we need representation. We need women of colour to make decisions about active travel. We need to say, why is it that that's a problem? And then we need to address it in a way that suits people of colour. You can't just assume that one size fits all. So representation and thinking about those different groups that are affected by policy is absolutely crucial.
I mean, that's interesting. Do you think it's the people who are economically marginalised or people of colour who feel more discriminated about being able to travel freely and confidently than those who are fairly well-to-do? I mean, is that something you found in your research, Kat?
I wouldn't want to speak for those people in any way, but as Jules has said, it's women of colour who are least likely to cycle. I think one thing to reflect on is that both access to travel and the consequences of unequal access to travel are sort of two parts of this problem. And so when you think about that unequal access to travel, it means access to services and potentially employment are also affected. And so you can almost see a circular thing where people being unable to travel freely then don't necessarily have the same opportunities and so we're almost stuck in a cycle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it doesn't make sense. Okay, so, Kat, if Boris Johnson was to come to you today, apart from running away, what would you do? What would be the first thing? What would be the one thing you would say to him that would help to improve the situation that we're talking about now?
Significant investment. So currently, I believe the budget has about £22 billion earmarked for roads, and about 5 million earmarked for active travel. And that discrepancy shows that the way that the current leadership think about these things and where their priorities are. And so I would want to see significantly greater investment in active travel, and I would want to see a balanced, diverse group of people heading up the policy creation to decide what to do with that significant investment.
Okay, and Julia, supposing the leader of Haringey Council came to you and said, okay, what's the one thing you would like me to do through the local authority? What would your answer be to that person?
They do more. So currently, to be fair on Haringey, they are addressing a lot of issues. They are doing a good job of trying to listen. But I think that there's a lot more that they can do. Driving is still seen as the priority in Haringey, and there's a lot of Living Streets are running a very strong campaign to say we want to redirect or circumvent or prevent altogether traffic that's going through Haringey from central London. And the likelihood is that a lot of those people won't need to make that journey by car, that they could carpool, they could take public transport, they could get there around a different way, and we could also make car routes longer and not fear the wrath of people who are taking a poor choice. We could actually make it easier for people to cycle and walk, and then yes, it might be an inconvenience to some of the polluting drivers out there, but that's something that we'll have to face. So I think it takes also some bravery on the council's part, and to say no, not everybody can drive through Haringey, and we need to prioritise reducing pollution and promote active travel.
It's the people who drive through Haringey from elsewhere that you're concerned about, not the people who live in Haringey, and a woman, for example, who might be taking a relative to a hospital by car, or a carer who had to come in for a woman who needed care. Is it the drive-through people that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I happen to be a part of Living Streets network, and they have told me that the majority of traffic in Haringey is caused by through traffic, and actually the majority of people in Haringey take public transport to get around, and especially in poorer areas, people can't necessarily afford cars, so it's even more necessary to enable active travel and to also make it easy for people to get around with public transport, especially during COVID, when public transport has to be restricted and then we can't all sit packed on a bus anymore. So yes, it has to be possible for especially people with disabilities and caring responsibilities who need to bring a wheelchair around or a pushchair, whatever it is. They need to be able to drive around without getting clogged up in traffic the whole time as well.
Okay, well, we're getting right to the end now. So let me ask you, Kat, if anybody wanted to find out more about active travel for women, where would they go to find out about it?
I think there are a number of great places. Sustrans, I believe, wrote that report that you talked about at the beginning. Rachel Aldred, as I mentioned, is a leading thinker in this space, and then Cycling UK have also done some really good work on cycling for women. Okay,
and Julia, if anybody wants to know about the Women's Equality Party, where would they go for that?
Go to womensequality.org.uk. You'll see everything you need to know to read about it, read about our 7 objectives, what we want to achieve, but also how to sign up. You can either sign up to a mailing list, you can join your local branch, you don't have to pay a thing to join in Haringey activities. And then, of course, if you want to become a formal member, you can vote on our policies and you can push for the environment to be pushed further up the Women's Equality Party agenda.
Okay, well, thank you for doing that. I mean, that's really interesting, and I'm really grateful you let a man interview you. And I'm glad you did, because I've learned a lot about active travel, because I didn't understand those things until I looked into this, until I did the webinar. It's a great thing doing webinars. You learn more than actually reading a book, so it's great to do. So thank you for doing that. It's been really interesting, and obviously you're both doing a great job on that, so keep doing it. And thank you, and we'll end this webinar interview now.